Welcome back, everyone. For our third deep dive, we're going to be talking about something pretty cool.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
It is.
So we're looking at how a customer from the European Center for Digital Transformation, they're the folks behind Uffective, saw some pretty wild changes just by using insights from, well, behavioral science.
So, like, changing how people act just by, what, understanding psychology.
Basically, yeah. Specifically, they were looking at this thing called the theory of planned behavior.
Okay, before we go any further, remind me about Uffective again.
Right. So Uffective is this platform. It helps companies get a grip on their IT, make better decisions, all that. It's like a personal trainer, but for your IT department. The European Center for Digital Transformation, they've been looking at how their customers use Uffective to, get people actually changing how they do things, which is what we're going to dive into today.
Okay, that makes sense. But just so we're clear, when we say managing IT, what does that even mean? Like, what are we actually talking about?
Well, this customer's research boils down to three main areas. First, you've got project portfolio management, or PPM. It's all about picking the right IT projects and making sure they get funded. But think about this, sometimes these investments can actually backfire. Some research shows like 13% of IT investments actually made things worse for the organization.
Whoa, hold on. So they spent money and it actually hurt them.
Yeah, and that's a lot of wasted money. That's where good PPM comes in. You want to make sure every dollar you spend on these projects is actually moving you forward.
Makes sense. What's next?
All right, so then we have project management. That's your classic PM. This is about making sure things get done right, on time, within budget, the whole 9 yards. But the thing is, not every IT project is a slam dunk, Some can even be really risky if they aren't managed carefully.
I see. So it's not just picking the right project, but making sure it goes smoothly too. Okay, what's the third area?
This one might surprise you. It's life cycle management, LCM for short. Think of it this way. You've already got a bunch of IT stuff, right? Systems, servers, software. LCM is about getting the most out of what you've already got. And here's the kicker. Get this. Maintaining the systems, it can eat up anywhere from 50 to 90% of your total IT budget.
Wow, that's huge. So much for all the fancy new projects if just keeping the lights on costs that much.
Right. So we've got our three areas. Choosing the right projects, making sure they actually work, and making the most of what you've already got. But what's this about human behavior? Where does that fit in? And you mentioned this theory of planned behavior.
Yeah, how does that all connect?
Okay, so that's where this customer's experience with Uffective gets really interesting. See, they built in this psychological model. It's called the theory of planned behavior, or TPB.
TPB, okay.
Basically, it tries to explain why we do things, or, why we don't do the things we maybe plan to do.
Like why I make those New Year's resolutions. And then,
Yeah, exactly. It's not always enough to just have good intentions, right?
So what else is there?
Well, according to this TPB thing, there are three big things that affect our intentions. First, there's your attitude. Like, do you actually think this IT management stuff is important, valuable, or is it just a chore, something you got to do?
Okay. Yeah, if you don't think something matters, you're probably not going to put much effort into it.
What's the second one?
Second one is called subjective norm. It's basically, well, social pressure. Like, do the people around you, your boss, colleagues, even those who maybe trained you, do they think good IT management is a big deal? And you know what? This is actually the strongest predictor of people's intentions in this research.
Interesting. So if my manager is always talking about how important IT management is, I'm more likely to get on board. Makes sense. Okay, what about that third factor?
Third one is called perceived behavioral control. It's all about whether you feel like you can actually do something, make a difference. Do you feel confident, or are you totally lost? Right, it's not just if IT management is objectively important, but if you actually feel like you can do something about it. You mentioned there were some surprising findings. What was so unexpected?
One of the really interesting things they found was that this perceived behavioral control wasn't as important as they thought it would be.
Really? So even if people didn't feel like they knew what they were doing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't super confident, they were still motivated to get better at IT management as long as they felt like, their colleagues and bosses cared about it.
So it's like peer pressure, but for good IT management. That's kind of wild. You'd think someone who wasn't confident would just be like, whatever.
Exactly. It shows how much social dynamics matter in the workplace.
So how do we actually use this? I mean, it's one thing to have research, but how do we put this into practice?
Well, this customer's experience with Uffective points to a couple of things. First, there's this idea of trigger words.
Trigger words. Okay, I'm intrigued. How do words magically make IT management better?
It's actually pretty simple. Just saying out loud that you want to improve IT impact can get the ball rolling.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah, it's like setting an internal goal, and that starts to change how you act. Instead of complaining about some project going over budget, try saying something like, I'm going to make sure our IT spending is actually making a difference.
Okay, that's surprisingly simple.
Right. But it can have a big impact. Of course, there's always more to it, but the point is, the words we use, they have power.
So it's like being more mindful of what we say, both to ourselves and to other people.
Exactly. Now, the second thing, and remember this was the biggest driver in the research, is, well, using that social pressure to your advantage.
So if my boss and colleagues are always talking about good IT management, I'm more likely to jump on board.
Yeah. So if you want to see real change in how IT is managed, you got to make it part of the conversation. Talk about it in team meetings, share articles, encourage your leadership to, show that they care about it too.
It's like creating a culture where good IT management is just...
Exactly. Now, you don't want to be all preachy about it, but creating that space for open discussion, sharing what works, that's how you start to shift attitudes.
Okay, so it's like weaving these conversations into our everyday work, just little by little. And how does Uffective fit into all of this?
Well, Uffective is designed to, kind of nudge people in the right direction, gently encourage those good IT management habits,
Nudges. Are
Yeah.
we talking about like subliminal messaging or something sneaky here?
No, nothing like that. It's more about making small changes to how information is presented or how the system works to encourage people to do the right thing.
Give me an example.
Sure. So Uffective might remind people to think about IT costs when they're planning a project.
Yeah.
Or, gently suggest that they document lessons learned after a project is finished.
Oh, okay, so it's like a helpful reminder to keep best practices top of mind.
Yeah.
But how does this all connect back to that theory of planned behavior?
Uffective actually uses the key parts of the TPB and how it's built. For example, it lets people actually write down their intentions for IT management, like setting specific goals.
So if I say, I'm going to cut down on project overruns by 10%, that actually makes a difference.
It can. Putting it in writing, making that commitment, it's a powerful thing. Uffective also helps with that subjective norm thing we talked about.
Right, the social pressure.
Yeah, it gives people a place to share their thoughts and expectations about IT management. Like they can comment on project proposals, give feedback, or just say, hey, I think this is important.
So it's like structured conversation designed to get everyone on the same page.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But what about that perceived behavioral control thing? How does Uffective make people feel like they can actually make a difference?
It does it in a couple of ways. First, it gives people access to, resources, best practices, things like that. So it's not just telling people what to do, it's giving them the tools to actually do it.
Right, like giving someone a recipe instead of just saying, make a cake.
Exactly. And the second thing Uffective does is it lets people track their progress. They can see how their efforts are actually making a difference. Like, are projects being delivered on time? Is the IT budget under control?
It's like that classic feedback loop. You see results, you feel good, you keep going. This Uffective sounds pretty impressive, but be honest, does it actually work?
It's a fair question. And you know what? The European Center for Digital Transformation has some pretty impressive case studies. For example, one organization, they saw a 20% drop in project overruns after using Uffective. Another one, their IT staff productivity went up by 15%.
Okay, so we're not just talking about good vibes. There are real, measurable results.
Right. And it all comes back to, using behavioral science to get people to change how they do things.
I'm really seeing the potential here. But I have to ask, are there any downsides?
That's a great question. And it's important to think about the potential downsides of, messing with people's behavior. Like, if you push too hard on the social pressure, you could end up with a culture where people are afraid to speak their minds.
Right, like nobody wants to rock the boat, even if they have a good idea. So how do we encourage healthy debate and still leverage social dynamics?
It's about finding that balance, right? We want people to do things the right way, but we don't want to stifle creativity. Open communication is key. Creating an environment where people feel safe to share their thoughts, even if they disagree.
It reminds me of that saying, what gets measured gets managed. Like, if we're only rewarding conformity, we're going to end up with a lot of yes men.
Absolutely. And that's why you got to be really thoughtful about how you use these behavioral science techniques. Constantly check if they're actually working the way you want them to.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's more like a toolbox, and you have to choose the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And if you do it right, Behavioral science can be a really powerful way to improve IP management and, help organizations succeed.
This is making so much sense to me.
Right.
We've got to be careful about how we apply these principles, but the potential is huge. But before we go too far, what's one thing our listeners can do today to start using this in their own work?
If I had to give just one piece of advice, it would be this. Start talking about it. Talk to your colleagues about why IT management is important. Share this research. Ask your boss if they'll support these ideas. Even just a small conversation can get the ball rolling.
I love that. It's simple. Anyone can do it, and you could have a ripple effect. So starting a conversation is the first step. I think this is a great place to pause for a moment, let our listeners think about everything we've discussed. We'll be right back with one final thought-provoking question to leave you with.
And we're back talking about how a customer from the European Center for Digital Transformation used Uffective to, change how people approach IT management. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? The theory, the practice, even some of those potential downsides to watch out for.
It's all about being smart about it, not going overboard. But before we wrap up, I want to kind of zoom out a bit. We've been talking about IT management inside organizations, but I'm thinking, could this apply to, bigger problems too?
That's an interesting thought. All this stuff, the trigger words, the social pressure, even those nudges, it's not just for IT departments, is it?
Right. I mean, we've got climate change, political divides, poverty, all these huge issues.
And they can feel so overwhelming, right? Like, what can one person even do?
Exactly. It feels like whatever I do is just a drop in the bucket.
But what if we could use these same ideas, to get people to tackle those bigger problems?
So instead of focusing on IT projects, we could be encouraging people to, I don't know, be more environmentally conscious or something.
Exactly. Imagine if, instead of feeling helpless, we actually felt empowered to make a difference, even in small ways. Like, what if our conversations, the things we see online, they all kind of nudged us towards a better world?
Okay, I like where you're going with this. That's a pretty inspiring vision. But how do we actually get there?
It starts with understanding, Once you realize how these things, the trigger words, the social norms, how they affect you, you start to see that you can have an impact. It's not about making some grand gesture. It's the small things,
Yeah.
Having those conversations, supporting good causes, being mindful of how you live.
It's like realizing that you're not just along for the ride, you can actually steer the wheel.
Exactly. And once you understand these behavioral science principles, you can be a lot more intentional about, creating the kind of change you want to see.
I love it. Think about your last team meeting. Could you have talked about making your IT projects more effective? What little thing can you do this week to start that conversation? Remember, a tiny nudge can make a big difference. This has been an awesome conversation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into behavioral science and IT management.
It was my pleasure.
We hope you've learned a lot and feel ready to put these ideas into action. Until next time, remember, change starts with each of us. Let's use what we've learned about human behavior to create a better future. This is The Deep Dive. Signing off.